Remake. The very word strikes fear into the heart of movie fans everywhere. In cinema, it can spell the literal downfall of a franchise, but in video games, it enables game developers to revisit, rebuild, and reintroduce their pride and joy to a fresh audience and a whole new generation of gamers. Horror gaming is more popular than ever, and remakes are very much the hot topic right now. But for every successful remake, there are still horror games that helped shape the genre and have somehow been left to gather dust on our prized gaming shelves. In this video, we're counting down 8 horror games that deserve full remakes, not remasters, not an anniversary edition, or any reimaginings, but a proper modern revival built for today's engines, modern audiences, and expectations. From cult favourites to genre-defining foundations, these are some of the horror games that deserve a second life, preferably before something else drags them into the shadows.
Make a wish? Okay. I want us to be together until the end of the world.
Splatterhouse first emerged in arcades in 1988 as something generally confrontational for its time. Drawing heavily from Western horror cinema, films like The Evil Dead, Friday the 13th, and splatter films in general, a tradition that would evolve in gaming over the next 3 decades, it stood apart from the other beat-em-ups by embracing grotesque imagery, body horror, and an oppressive sense of place. Players controlled Rick Taylor, an ordinary college student bound to the ancient Terror Mask, after his girlfriend Jennifer is abducted and left for dead inside the cursed West Mansion. From the outset, Splatterhouse framed its violence not as spectacle, but as desperation. Rick is not a hero, but an injured survivor being slowly consumed by something far more ancient and darker than himself.
Fun? You're gonna have to learn to love the pain. There's a lot more of it to come.
The story, while simple on the surface, carried surprising subtext. The Terror Mask is not benevolent, it sustains Rick only as long as he continues its bloody work. Jennifer's condition, hovering between life and death, adds a constant emotional stake, while the mansion itself feels alive, hostile and aware. Walls bleed, corpses reanimate, and enemies resemble tortured remnants of past victims rather than conventional monsters. Even in 1988, Splatterhouse suggested that Rick's salvation might come at the cost of his humanity, a theme modern horror games now explore far more explicitly.
What have you done to me?
The home console ports helped cement Splatterhouse's cult legacy. The TurboGrafx-16 version was the closest adaptation to the arcade original, preserving much of its violence and tone, while other versions were heavily censored to meet platform standards of the time. Despite these compromises, the core atmosphere survived. Isolation, dread, and relentless forward momentum through a space that offered no refuge. These ports introduced Splatterhouse to a wider audience, even if they blunted its sharpest edges. The franchise expanded with sequels in the early 1990s, drifting closer to traditional action horror before the 2010 reboot attempted to modernise the series outright.
But he asked for me specially, remember?
Gee, I wonder why.
While visually impressive and unflinchingly violent, and very enjoyable, it struggled with tonal inconsistency, mixing grotesque horror with juvenile humour and suffering from uneven pacing and repetition. Still, it proves something important. The core concept of Splatterhouse works in a modern 3D space. The mansion, the mask, and Rick's physical degradation translated effectively, even if the execution lacked restraint. This is precisely why Splatterhouse feels primed for an attentive, respectful remake rather than another reinvention. A modern approach could lean fully into survival horror, slower movement, weightier attacks, environmental interaction, and a constant sense of vulnerability. Rick's relationship with the Terror Mask could be framed as a psychological struggle.
You're mine, Rick.
With whispered guidance, threats, and half-truths blurring the line between survival and corruption. Combat would remain brutal, but purposeful, reinforcing the cost of violence rather than indulging in excess. In today's horror landscape, where franchises like Resident Evil, Silent Hill, and Dead Space have shown that faithful remakes can thrive, Splatterhouse could finally find its true home. Its theme of bodily loss, corrupted heroism, and violence as survival resonate more strongly now than they did in 1988. With careful pacing, tonal restraint, and modern storytelling tools, Splatterhouse wouldn't return as a relic of shock value, but as a grim, atmospheric horror experience that feels both timeless and newly relevant.
It's good to be back.
Uninvited arrived on the NES in 1991 as an unusually restrained and unsettling horror experience. especially within the limits of Nintendo's family-friendly platform. Originally developed for home computers, Uninvited stood apart from most console games of its era by abandoning reflex-based action almost entirely. Instead, it focused on exploration, tension, and quiet dread, placing players in the role of an unnamed protagonist who awakens injured outside a sprawling, decaying mansion with no memory of how he survived and a missing sister. Rather than relying on overt violence, Uninvited built its terror through implication and atmosphere. The mansion is cold, silent and hostile, filled with locked doors, hidden passages, and rooms that feel wrong long before anything actually happens. Ghosts, witches and supernatural entities lurk throughout the estate, but encounters are sudden and punishing rather than frequent. Death can come quickly and without warning, reinforcing the sense that the player is fragile, unprepared, and deeply out of place. Survival depends not on combat skill, but on observation, caution, and learning the rules of an unfamiliar world. Narratively, Uninvited is sparse but effective. Storytelling unfolds through environmental clues, item descriptions, and the gradual revelation of the mansion's tragic past. It becomes clear that the house is not merely haunted, but shaped by betrayal, occult practices, and unresolved suffering. The protagonist's own connection to the mansion emerges slowly, encouraging players to assemble meaning themselves rather than having it explained outright. This ambiguity was unusual for the time and gave the game its lingering, unsettling quality. The NES version, where visually simplified compared to its computer counterparts, preserved the game's oppressive tone remarkably well. Limited colour palettes and static screens worked in its favour, forcing the imagination to fill in the gaps. The sound design was especially effective, using tense, minimalist 8-bit music to establish a haunting atmosphere, like this song here. In an era dominated by bright sprites and heroic power fantasies, Uninvited felt deliberately uncomfortable and slow, qualities that alienated some players but deeply resonated with others. Despite its cult status, Uninvited has largely been left behind as horror gaming evolved. Its point-and-click structure, trial-and-error design, and lack of guidance would likely frustrate modern audiences without refinement. Yet these same elements form a strong foundation for a thoughtful remake. A modern version could preserve the game's deliberate pacing, whilst introducing clearer environmental feedback, smoother interaction systems, and optional guidance that respects players' intelligence without diluting tension. In a gaming era where Telltale is a household game in name and choice-driven and narrative-focused horror thrives, there is clearly a home, pun intended, for a game like this. In today's horror landscape where psychological unease and environmental storytelling are once again prized, Uninvited feels surprisingly relevant. Its themes of vulnerability, isolation, and uncovering truth through exploration align naturally with modern horror sensibilities. With careful polish and a respectful update, Uninvited could evolve from a forgotten NES curiosity into a quiet, slow-burning horror experience that feels both contemporary and faithful to its eerie origins.
He said to leave you alive. Enjoy your new life.
The Suffering arrived on the PlayStation 2 in 2004 as a rare blend of psychological horror and action that leaned heavily into atmosphere, guilt, and punishment. Developed by Surreal Software, it was set almost entirely within Carnate Island Prison, a decaying execution facility steeped in violence and cruelty.
I heard he killed his old lady and kids. Sick motherfucker.
Be quiet, you jerry-curled fool. Don't you know who that is?
Players take control of Talk, a death row inmate with no memory of the familiar side that put him there, who awakens in the middle of a supernatural catastrophe as the prison collapses into chaos.
You got to get me out of here! No!
From the outset, The Suffering positions horror not just in monsters and environments, but in the uncertainty of the protagonist himself. Rather than presenting evil as something external, The Suffering makes it deeply personal. The island is haunted by grotesque creatures that embody methods of execution, such as lethal injections, hanging, and gas chambers, and turns the prison's history into literal monsters. Combat is frequent and aggressive, but it is framed as survival rather than empowerment. Ammunition is scarce, melee combat is risky, and enemies are relentless, reinforcing the feeling that Talk is trapped in a place designed to break him down, both physically and mentally. Narratively, the game is driven by ambiguity and moral uncertainty. As Talk explores the prison and its surrounding island, fragments of his tragic past emerge through hallucinations, environmental storytelling, and interactions with other survivors.
He'll help you if you keep him safe.
He's weak.
Now, the only idea I have is that we gotta call for help.
Throughout the journey, talk is accompanied by disembodied voices in his head, functioning as a twisted angel and devil dynamic that comment on his actions, judge his choices, and embody his internal struggle between guilt and denial. Players are repeatedly forced to make moral decisions, whether to help, abandon, or kill other characters, and these choices help shape Talk's personality. These decisions can also transform our anti-hero into a devastating monster, which makes him superpowered against enemies for short periods of time. If he embraces the darker side of his personality, these actions can completely change the outcome of the game. Crucially, the suffering never confirms the truth of Talk's past until the very end, taking these decisions into account, allowing doubt and self-judgment to linger throughout the experience. The PS2 version excelled at creating an oppressive atmosphere despite technical limitations. Harsh lighting, heavy shadows, and grim sound design worked together to make Carnite Island feel hostile and inescapable. The soundtrack leaned on industrial noise and distorted ambience rather than traditional music, heightening tension during exploration and combat alike. While the controls and camera occasionally show their age in the modern day, the sense of place and tone is still strong enough to carry the experience. Despite its popularity, the suffering has been largely absent from modern horror discussions, partly due to its reliance on dated mechanics and partly because it straddled the line between action and horror at a time where the genre was still finding its footing. Another factor is that Surreal Software, the studio behind the game, no longer exists, leaving the series without its original creative steward. Yet this absence also makes the suffering a strong candidate for a remake. A modern version could refine combat pacing, deepen the enemy variety, and place greater emphasis on psychological tension over constant confrontation, without losing the game's brutal identity. In today's horror landscape, where themes of guilt, trauma, and moral consequence are increasingly central, the suffering feels strikingly relevant. Its focus on personal horror, player choice, and environments shaped by human cruelty aligns naturally with modern gaming horror. With the right game engine and more deliberate approach to pacing and storytelling, the suffering could return not just as a relic of early 2000s horror, but as a powerful character-driven experience that finally realises the depth it always hinted at.
I heard about you in the news. I got a friend at the DA's office. Says the prosecutor on your case is being indicted.
Sweet Home, released on the NES in 1989, as a quiet, revolutionary horror experience that would go on to shape the genre more than almost any other game of its era. Developed by Capcom as a tie-in to Kiyoshi Kurosawa's film of the same name, Sweet Home stood apart from contemporary RPGs by fusing exploration, limited resources, and permanent consequences within a deeply unsettling haunted house setting. Players control a small documentary crew trapped inside the ruined mansion of artist Akira Mamiya, uncovering the horrific truth behind the house and its former inhabitants, piece by piece. Unlike action-driven games of the time, Sweet Home built tension through vulnerability and restraint. Each character possessed unique abilities, such as using a vacuum, lighter, or medical kit, but inventory space was severely limited, forcing difficult decisions about what to carry and what to abandon. Death was permanent. If a character died, they were gone for the rest of the game, along with their skills and items. This sense of irreversible loss gave considerable weight to every encounter and mistake, creating a constant undercurrent of dread that was very rare on an NES title. Narratively, Sweet Home relied heavily on environmental storytelling. Notes scrawled on the walls, bloodstained diaries, and fragmented memories revealing the tragic fate of the Mamiya family and the malevolent presence that's haunting the mansion. Rather than delivering its story through exposition, the game trusted players to piece together events themselves, reinforcing the feeling of trespassing into a space steeped in grief and violence. The mansion feels less like a dungeon and more like a crime scene saturated with sorrow and resentment. The influence of Sweet Home on modern survival horror cannot be overstated. Many of its core ideas, limited inventory, puzzle-driven progression, locked doors, key items, vulnerable protagonists, and horror rooted in one place, directly inspired Resident Evil. In many ways, Sweet Home is the blueprint from which Resident Evil emerged, translating its top-down RPG structure into a cinematic survival horror framework. Without Sweet Home, simply, the genre as we know it would likely not exist. Despite its legacy, Sweet Home itself has never received a modern revisit. Its presentation is bound by 8-bit limitations, and its systems, whilst forward-thinking, are rough by contemporary standards. Yet these same systems are perfectly suited to a thoughtful remake. A modern version could expand the mansion into a fully explorable, interconnected environment, deepen character interactions, and heighten tension through lighting, sound design, and dynamic enemy encounters, all whilst preserving the original's emphasis on scarcity and consequence. Kind of like, say, Resident Evil.
What is it?
Look out! It's a monster!
Let me take care of it!
As a survivor horror experience, Sweet Home could be phenomenal if handled with care. Its focus on ordinary people, irreversible loss, and a location shaped by tragedy aligns seamlessly with modern horror tropes. Rather than competing with Resident Evil, a remake could stand alongside it as the genre's forgotten origin story, an intimate, oppressive, and emotionally resonant horror game that finally receives recognition not just as an influence, but as a landmark experience in its own right. Condemned: Criminal Origins arrived in 2005 as one of the standout launch-era titles for the Xbox 360, and despite being far more recent than many horror classics, it's always felt like a game ahead of its time. Developed by Monolith Productions, Condemned rejected gothic monsters and biohazards in favour of something far more grounded and unsettling: abandoned urban spaces, derelict buildings, and violence rooted in human decay and condition. Players step into the role of Ethan Thomas, an FBI serial crimes unit investigator, framed for murder and forced to navigate a city collapsing into madness. Rather than empowering the player, Condemned thrives on discomfort and vulnerability. Combat is brutal, improvised, and intentionally awkward, often relying on scavenged melee weapons that break after repeated use. Firearms are rare and unreliable, reinforcing the sense that Ethan is not a soldier, but a man barely holding himself together. The environments, which include subway tunnels, condemned apartment blocks, and slaughterhouses, are claustrophobic and grimy, with lighting and sound design doing as much work as the enemies themselves. Every encounter feels desperate, unpredictable, and personal. Condemned leans heavily into psychological and investigative horror. Crime scene analysis plays a central role, with players reconstructing murders using forensic tools rather than cutscenes. As Ethan digs deeper into the city's violence, the line between external threat and internal collapse begins to blur. Hallucinations, unreliable perception, and a growing sense of paranoia slowly undermine the player's confidence, creating a creeping dread that escalates alongside the story. The horror comes not from spectacle but from doubt, about the world, about other people, and about Ethan himself. What makes Condemned especially interesting in hindsight is how closely it aligns with modern procedural horror design. Games like Alan Wake 2 similarly use investigation, fragmented reality, and psychological instability as core mechanics, rather than narrative dressing. Another clear comparison can be drawn to Observer, which also blends detective work with unreliable perception. Using environment and player interaction to unravel a fractured mind, Condemned was exploring these ideas years before they become widely accepted. Despite its cult reputation, Condemned: Criminal Origins has never received a remake or a modern re-release, and its sequel shifted more towards action, which diluted the original's raw intensity. Yet the first game remains uniquely positioned for a modern revisit. A remake could refine melee combat, enhance environmental interaction, and push its investigative systems further, while using contemporary lighting, audio, and animation to heighten its oppressive realism. The core design, slow, methodical, and psychologically corrosive, already aligns closely with modern horror sensibilities. In today's horror landscape, where grounded psychological experiences are increasingly valued, Condemned feels less like an artifact of the mid-2000s and more like a missing link between classic horror and modern investigative nightmares. Its focus on human violence, decaying spaces, and mental collapse would resonate powerfully with contemporary audiences. With careful treatment and restraint, Condemned: Criminal Origins could return not just as a cult favourite, but as a defining example of procedural horror done right: brutal, intimate, and deeply unsettling. Silent Hill 4: The Room, released in 2004 as the most unconventional entry in the original Silent Hill quadrilogy, and for that reason, it remains one of the most divisive. Developed by Team Silent, it deliberately broke away from the foggy streets and cult mythology that defined the earlier games. instead centering its horror on a single intimate idea, being trapped inside your own home. Players control Henry Townsend, a quiet, detached man who awakens to find himself inexplicably sealed inside his apartment, unable to leave except for a mysterious hole that appears in his bathroom wall.
What the hell?
What makes Silent Hill 4 so unsettling is how it weaponizes familiarity. The apartment, or Room 302 to be specific, initially functions as the player's only safe space. It is clean, quiet, homely, and free from enemies, a place to recover and observe the outside world through windows and peepholes. But as the game progresses, that safety erodes. Hauntings creep in, walls bleed, ghosts manifest where none should exist. The game slowly dismantles the idea of home as refuge, replacing it with paranoia and violation. Horror no longer waits outside, it simply moves in.
Hey there, little Walter. Just a little longer now.
Narratively, the game explores obsession, isolation, and emotional neglect through the story of Walter Sullivan, a serial killer whose ritualistic murders are tied to Room 302 itself. Rather than relying on overweight exposition, Silent Hill 4 tells its story through fragmented memories, corrupted environments, and symbolic spaces drawn from Walter's trauma. Henry's passive nature is intentional. He's not a traditional protagonist but a vessel caught in someone else's unresolved pain. He just wants to be left alone.
Say, will you help me find it? I'm kinda scared all alone.
This emotional distance reinforces the game's themes of detachment and helplessness, making the horror feel invasive rather than confrontational. Mechanically, Silent Hill 4 was controversial. Escorting Eileen, the shift to more combat-focused sections, and the reuse of locations frustrated many players at the time. As a result, it is often labelled the weakest of the original 4 games. Yet this reputation tends to overshadow what the game does exceptionally well: sustained psychological pressure. The presence of invincible ghosts, the limited means of defense, and the creeping corruption of the apartment create a constant low-level dread that few entries in the series manage to sustain so effectively.
I never got to do that special favor for you.
In hindsight, Silent Hill 4 feels eerily ahead of its time. Modern horror has increasingly focused on domestic spaces, psychological intrusion, and the fear of nowhere being safe. Ideas that The Room explored nearly 2 decades ago. With the upcoming remake of Silent Hill and persistent rumours surrounding a remake of Silent Hill 3, this entry now feels uniquely positioned for reconsideration. Its core concept is strong, distinctive, and perfectly suited to modern horror design and storytelling tools. A respectful remake could refine its rough edges without diluting its identity, expanding the apartment's interactivity, deepening the haunting systems, and tightening pace would allow the horror to breathe more naturally. Most importantly, it could fully realise the game's central idea, that the most terrifying place is not a foggy town or an abandoned hospital, but your own home. Once a sanctuary, now a prison. Seen through that lens, Silent Hill 4 is not the weakest of the original entries, but one of the most disturbing and one of the most deserving of a second chance. Dino Crisis, released in 1999 as one of Capcom's boldest experiments, often mischaracterized as Resident Evil with dinosaurs, despite being fundamentally different in tone, mechanics, and intent. Directed by Shinji Mikami, Dino Crisis traded gothic horror for sterile laboratories and high-tech facilities, replacing zombies with fast, intelligent predators that could stalk, flank, and retreat. Players take control of Regina, a Special Forces operative sent to investigate a research facility where time itself is fractured, unleashing prehistoric terror into the modern world. Where Resident Evil relied on slow, predictable enemies, Dino Crisis was defined by constant pressure. Dinosaurs were agile, aggressive, and capable of appearing through doors, vents, and shattered windows, keeping players in a state of near-permanent tension.
That's disgusting.
Combat emphasized decision-making over brute force, allowing players to use tranquilizers, lethal ammunition, or environmental hazards depending on the situation. Ammunition scarcity, tight inventory management, and healing limitations, all familiar to Resident Evil fans, ensured that every encounter felt dangerous, reinforcing the sense that escape, not domination, was the ultimate goal.
Don't move.
And what do you think you're doing?
Dino Crisis leaned into science fiction horror, weaving together time travel, corporate secrecy, and ethical failure. The research facility becomes a battleground, not just between humans and dinosaurs, but between competing ideologies represented by Regina's team. Moral choices and branching paths subtly influence progression and endings, encouraging replayability whilst reinforcing the theme that human ambition often creates its own monsters. The story unfolds gradually through documents, dialogue, and environmental clues, rather than overt exposition. Atmospherically, the game was a technical showcase for its time. Using real-time 3D environments rather than pre-rendered backgrounds, Dino Crisis allowed for dynamic camera movement and persistent enemy threats, increasing immersion and unpredictability. Sound design played a crucial role. Distant roars, sudden crashes, and the absence of music during exploration heightened the anxiety. The facility itself felt alive and unsafe, a space that could never truly be secured. Dino Crisis has remained dormant for years, yet it is consistently one of the most requested franchises in remake discussions. This is partly because its core design has aged remarkably well, and partly because Capcom have demonstrated extraordinary care and success with modern remakes. The recent reimaginings of Resident Evil have shown how classic survival horror can be respectfully modernized without losing identity, and Dino Crisis sits perfectly positioned to receive the same treatment. In today's horror landscape, Dino Crisis will not feel like a derivative experiment, but a distinct survival horror experience built around speed, intelligence, and relentless pursuit. A modern remake could expand enemy behaviour, refine combat systems, and fully realise its sci-fi horror setting with contemporary technology. Capcom have already proved it knows how to do this, and with Dino Crisis the foundation is already there, preserved in gold, and waiting to be brought back from extinction. The recent reimaginings of Resident Evil have shown how classic survival horror can be respectfully modernised without losing identity, and Dino Crisis sits perfectly positioned to receive the same treatment.
There are only 3 STARS members left now. Captain Wesker, Barry, and myself. We don't know where Chris is.
Resident Evil is the final entry on this list, not because it is forgotten, but because it remains the foundation upon which modern survival horror was built. Released in 1996, the original Resident Evil established a language of the genre. Limited resources, oppressive environments, puzzle-driven progression, and horror rooted in place rather than spectacle.
What is this? Wow! What a mansion!
Set almost entirely within the Spencer Mansion, the game trapped players in a carefully paced nightmare where every door creak, camera cut, and distant groan reinforce vulnerability and dread. Resident Evil is deceptively simple yet deeply effective. What begins as a search and rescue mission slowly unravels into a story of corporate arrogance, unethical experimentation, and total institutional collapse. The mansion itself becomes a character, layered, secretive, and hostile, revealing its history through traumatic journals, modern laboratories, and hidden passages. Rather than overwhelming players with exposition, the game allows unease to grow naturally, trusting atmosphere and implication to do the work.
What is this place?
Not quite your ordinary house, that's for sure.
The 2002 remake is rightly considered a benchmark in horror game design. It expanded the mansion, refined puzzles, introduced new threats like Crimson Heads and the invincible Lisa Trevor, and elevated the atmosphere to near perfection within a fixed camera framework. Even today, it is often cited as one of the greatest remakes ever made, but crucially, that achievement does not invalidate the possibility of doing it all over again, because the tools, expectations, and language of horror have evolved dramatically since 2002. Capcom's modern remakes have proven exactly how transformative that evolution can be. Using the RE engine, games like Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 4 didn't just update the visuals, they redefined how classic spaces, enemies, and stories could be experienced. The over-shoulder camera, dynamic lighting, reactive environments, and grounded character performances brought immediacy and tension that felt both modern and faithful. Applying the same approach to Resident Evil feels less like a risk and more like an inevitability, and would produce a phenomenal game to boot. Stalking the halls of the Spencer Mansion with an over-the-shoulder camera would fundamentally rejuvenate the experience. Shadow-soaked corridors and tight spaces would feel more claustrophobic, enemy encounters more unpredictable, and exploration more intimate. The mansion's iconic layout, already one of the strongest in gaming history, would gain new life through real-time lighting, spatial audio, and environmental detail. Familiar rooms could become newly terrifying, not because they've changed, but because the player's relationship to them has. Even with the legacy of the 2002 remake looming large, Resident Evil still has the potential to set the benchmark once again. A full remake built in the modern RE engine wouldn't replace what came before it, it would simply stand alongside it, reintroducing the genre's birthplace to a new generation in the language of contemporary horror.
What? What is this?
The foundation is already there, Capcom have already shown it knows how to do this, and if any game deserves to redefine survival horror twice, it's Resident Evil.
Resident Evil.
What makes this prospect so compelling is not the nostalgia but confidence. The design is proven, the setting is iconic, the technology is ready. A modern Resident Evil remake would not be seen as an experiment, it would be a statement, reaffirming why the genre exists at all, and why the Spencer Mansion remains one of the most important locations in horror gaming history. And that's the list. Horror gaming has always been shaped by risk, by ideas that were bold, flawed, and ahead of their time. The games on this list didn't just scare and transfix the players, they laid foundations, pushed boundaries, and, in many cases, inspired entire generations of horror that followed. With modern technology, refined design philosophies, and a renewed respect for atmosphere and restraint, these titles aren't asking to be replaced, they're asking to be re-examined. Brought to the new generation of gamers, done right, a remake doesn't erase the history, it completely honours it. And if the last few years has proven anything, it's that horror gaming isn't just alive, it's evolving. The question isn't whether these games deserve another chance, it's who will be brave enough to give it to them. If you enjoyed the video, like and subscribe so you don't miss any future content. What horror games do you think should be given the remake treatment? Drop them in the comments below, I might just make another video and credit you with your choices. Thank you for watching.